Good evening, fellow Floridians, fellow Americans, and friends from all over the world who love the state of Florida the same way that I do. Thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Mike Levine, coming to you from Glass House Media, broadcasting out of downtown Mount Dora, Florida. Today, we're going to take a quick look at the Declaration of Independence, just see how different it was for our founding fathers as they cut ties with England. And then we can take a look at the list of grievances that they delivered to the world to explain the rationale for separation from England. And we'll see how we're doing on those particular grievances today. So, one of the first things that the founding fathers revealed to the world is that lawfare was a big deal in the 1770s as King George utilized his power over the law to wreak havoc and to make life really uncomfortable and really difficult for the 13 colonies. That's still happening today. You can see it in our legislature. And of course, now we're fighting among ourselves, but we also have global influence. And we'll get to that in a couple of these slides here. But, the idea that people in charge of power tighten up the enforcement of the law and relax it according to their own self-interest is not anything new. Our founding fathers went through it as well. Another thing that the king did in the days of the 13 colonies was made it difficult to hold legislative sessions. So basically, the king would have legislative sessions in places that were very difficult for people to reach, made travel time very difficult, put them through a lot of hardship, had convened the legislature in Europe instead of over here. And again, just a bunch of lawfare, just like a lot of the stuff that we're going through right now. King George actually dissolved many legislative bodies because he just didn't want to hear the complaints from his constituents, right? And of course, we're going through the same thing now. I mean, this is classic Republican Party of Florida stuff. And, I pick on the Republican Party of Florida because I'm a Republican, and that's the most important thing to me. But the Democrats are even worse. And it's really sad for the no party affiliation voters and voters of minor parties because they have absolutely no voice at all. So again, I just would challenge everybody to take a look around the state of Florida and see how many counties are either hard Republican or hard Democrat, because that means that the elections in those counties are decided in the primary. And, that's another whole story about the advantages and disadvantages to low voter turnout, because again, I think most of us who follow politics understand that voter turnout in primary elections is lower than in general elections. So that's the reason why the stakeholders in the counties tend to gravitate to one political party or the other, regardless of ideology. It just makes it easier and less expensive to win elections in low turnout elections like primaries and special elections also. Back in the days of our forefathers, they were particularly interested in immigration and naturalization of people moving into the area because they really wanted and needed those populations to help them settle the land. So in order to resist our founding fathers, the king set very tight regulations on land acquisitions to make it difficult for people to immigrate to the country and to naturalize. It's also interesting that King George back in those days understood the power of the judicial system as well. So again, I liken King George or any other ruler like that to Pharaoh back in biblical times. And of course, when you think about a king or a pharaoh or a high ranking political leader, we have to understand that it's not just the leader. The leader has legions of people working for them, and including, in the king's case, a judiciary. And of course, back in those days, the colonists complained that King George would condition a judge's tenure. He would fire a judge, or he would withhold their salary or control their salaries based on the judge deciding cases the way that the king wanted the cases decided. So, of course, that hasn't gone away. Over the last couple of years, we've had wars, lawfare wars over the judiciary, and I think that's going to continue over the next couple of years. It'll be really interesting to see how the relationship between left-leaning, I would go as far as to say controlled judges deal with the Trump administration. And of course, Pam Bondi is our Attorney General, and I'm crossing my fingers that tomorrow, February 20th, Kash Patel will be formally confirmed into the FBI director position. So that's going to be something as it relates to, again, you can consider the king, the executive branch, and then he's running the judges. And we've already talked a little bit about the way King George handled the legislative branch. But it seems like 250 years later, we're kind of dealing with the same junk that our forefathers dealt with. It's also interesting that the king in those days needed big bureaucracies to control the citizens of the colonies. Of course, 13 separate colonies with 13 separate governmental bodies, all under the crown of England. And King George would send over according to our Declaration of Independence and the rationale for separating from the crown, the colonists said that the king would send over large bureaucracies of people who would swarm their communities, which means that they invaded into their houses and, certainly overreached their respectable authority and made it really difficult. I can only imagine living in those times and having police forces and armies and things like that kick your door down, rob you of your groceries, do what they want to with your women, your sons, daughters, the violence, all of that, really horrible. But my concern is, of course, that some pretty horrible things going on in the world right now. And if it wasn't for our election in November of 2024, we could be staring down the barrel of some of that stuff. So I'm really grateful that Donald Trump won the election and we're able to at least have a chance to turn this country around. But I'd also like to submit to you that Trump winning the presidency did not solve the problem. And yes, we're seeing lightning speed coming out of the Trump administration, and I'm thrilled about it. I know a lot of other Americans feel the same way. But we can't take that for granted. Trump has a 4-year term. We got a lot to do in those 4 years. Everybody in this audience needs to be on board. And then we need to be prepared for the next term and a few terms after that. Hopefully, we'll be able to wake up Americans and the rest of the world to the importance of nationalism and the horrors of globalism so that we can preserve really the dignity of humanity. This is another interesting point, that King George rendered the military superior and to the civilian law, which made the colonies a military state. And That's something else, that we've experienced over, 2020, 2022. We had all the riots around the country, the burning and pillaging of our cities and towns. And this chaos just opens the door for military intrusion. And then when that happens, the lines started getting really blurry about what is an acceptable use of the military within the country. And we certainly don't want to be in a situation where the military is superior or not subordinate to civilian authorities and control. This next point is something that's really on my heart, because even back in the 1770s, the King of England was making deals with other countries as it related to the 13 colonies over here in North America. So our founding fathers complained that the king made deals with foreign powers who attempted to impose foreign law over the colonies. And that's very similar to what we're seeing today with the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, those kind of things. And so again, this is just an example where 250 years later, we're still fighting the same battles. So we need to develop a national consciousness. We need to do a much better job, especially when you get into public schools and how our children are raised and the degree of civics that our kids are taught. But in reality, for me personally, I believe that parents need to take in charge of that. We can't just leave ourselves exposed to what the school districts want to do. We have to make sure that our kids get the understanding and knowledge that they need. And the first order of responsibility in educating our kids is at home. It's also interesting that our founding fathers complained that the king and the administrative state, the bureaucracy back in those days, would actually protect murderous regimes from committing capital crimes in the colonies. And again, this is something too over the last couple of years we've seen. So, not to beat a drum, but it's true that we're still seeing in these days a lot of the same issues that our founding fathers saw. Yeah, in order to bankrupt and starve out the colonies, King George also cut off foreign trade from the colonies. So as the colonies were creating products, mostly agricultural products back in those times, the king was cutting off trading routes and making it impossible for our forefathers to sell their goods in the international market. And then, of course, we have taxation. From this particular point, we get the phrase taxation without representation. And of course, that was happening back in the 1770s, as we came closer to 1776 and the signing of our Declaration of Independence. The king, of course, in a faraway land that is a territory of the crown, this was just a cash register for them. So as they saw our founding fathers become more and more productive with the various different enterprises that they were engaged in, the king just saw that as a big money pot and a cash register. And of course, now we're looking at Doge uncovering all the waste, fraud, and abuse, to say it mildly, and what's going on. And it's the same thing, where these government bureaucracies just see our economies as just a cash cow and how to get money. And then once the money comes into the government, where it goes after that is up for grabs. And of course, that is the whole impetus for why everybody wants to be close to the government. It's because all the money's there. And once the money goes into government, it's not the same. The government doesn't protect our money the way we protect our own money. So it goes to the old saying about other people's money. Donald Trump says it all the time, loves to use other people's money. And that makes perfect sense. But the government as we're seeing with DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, that the government is not as protective as our money, as we would be of our money. So this is just a fundamental problem with government. And it's not just in the federal government. I would suggest that if we did a DOGE in Florida, we'd probably find a lot of stuff there, and probably in our county commissions and city councils as well. Just like to point out that as King George was negotiating for the sale of our 13 colonies over here, they were dealing with foreign countries, and as a method to make the colonists more compliant, then the king and foreign business partners would impose foreign laws on British citizens who were accustomed to English law, which was very disruptive at the time. So you can see, as anxious as we get about what's going on in our government right now, our founding fathers were just as anxious about what was going on back then, of course, leading them to separate from the crown, England, and to create this great country of America. And I must say at this particular point that limited government is the key to the whole thing. And certainly, since our independence, we've allowed our government to get way too big, way too bureaucratic. And many would say that when the government becomes 50% of the economy, the party's over. I mean, we're just not a free market economy anymore. And I've seen that coming for many, many years, and I've always been very concerned about it. When things got really hot, King George abdicated his responsibilities over the colonies and said, we don't govern you anymore. And then actually waged war on the colonies before the colonies established their Declaration of Independence. So again, isn't it interesting and of course, we're a young country, only 250 years old. Other countries have been through this probably time and time again. But in previous times, and I know that a lot of people that were very close to the government, scholars, have said that they were not optimistic about the future of America staying sovereign. I never went that far myself personally, that I realized the possibility of that happening, but I never resigned myself to that outcome. And again, fortunately, with all that's going on in the Trump administration, I feel really good about America's future today, and I hope you do too. So in the final analysis leading up to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the framers just pointed out to the world that the crown was ravishing our coasts and burning our cities and destroying the lives of our people. And you could say with illegal immigration the way it is, that's exactly what's happening here. The massive invasion from other countries into our country with people who do not share our lifestyle whatsoever. They're completely incompatible at this point in their lives. They're incompatible, in my opinion, with American culture. Many of them are actually military-ready people who are a dangerous threat to our country. And I'm sure that most of you watching this video will agree with that. Maybe some not, but send me a text message or an email if you want to talk to me about that. But it's really important because this is what happens. As we lead up to war, things get more and more serious, more and more violent, more and more brutal, until full-scale war breaks out. So that was the process that our founding fathers went through. And as I know that many of us have been stressed over the last several years about the future of our country, I just hope that my friends in my Republican conservative audience will actually be willing to take the personal steps to restore us to a form of limited government, which actually means, as we're seeing in the federal government, that the actual dollar values of our annual budgets go down and we leave more money in the private sector for the citizens of our great country to manage and create more prosperity and wealth through low taxation and low regulation. Probably one of the worst things in the Declaration of Independence is the realization that the colonists were captured, taken out on ships, and then forced to become mercenaries against their friends and neighbors, or take their own lives because they were not willing to do that. And that is just a very, very difficult situation to be in. I know you can agree, but imagine what would happen if somebody took you as a prisoner and then gave you an ultimatum that you either need to become a mercenary and go kill your friends and neighbors and maybe family members, or the only other alternative would be to take your own life. And that's really just a really bad place to be. So as the founding fathers were kind of closing out their final arguments against the crown and explaining to the rest of the world the rationale for separation from the crown, this was a big, heavy-duty statement, and one of the final statements before they go into the closing remarks of the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, another big thing that happened back then, of course, we had the Native American Indians on the continent then, and the founding fathers pointed out that the crown had incited violence among the Native Americans, causing an insurrection here in the States. And again, that's not too dissimilar from the illegal immigration crisis that I'd love to say that the Trump administration has already turned off, because that's the numbers that we're seeing. We're seeing all-time low border crossings, at the southern border. So obviously we're very optimistic and positive about that. But I'm just saying to you that the crown inciting insurrection through antagonizing and inciting violence from the Native American Indians that were here at the time is not a lot different than the massive influx of illegals coming across our border. So this is just another example that our founding fathers dealt with a lot of the same things we're dealing with now. I would suggest that if our politicians were more dutiful, then we would have headed off some of these problems. We shouldn't be having to live these problems over and over again. Then the founding fathers made their final plea. And they said, we've petitioned the government for redress. We've humbly asked. We even talked to fellow citizens back in England, and our fellow citizens didn't hear our outcry about the injustices. So at that particular point, there was nothing left to do than separate from the crown. We have the same situation here. I just said a moment ago, isn't it possible that Americans will be so complacent that even under the risk of the loss of our freedom, that we wouldn't stand up and fight for our own rights? And that's a real possibility. So I think this is one of the reasons that I'm doing these videos. I just want to do as much as I personally can to wake Americans up about what we have, about the freedom and liberty and justice for all in this country that we have. And it's really easy to take that for granted if we've never experienced anything else. So this is my plea to my friends and neighbors and colleagues and everybody around the country and around the world who value liberty, freedom, justice for all, to dig our heels in, educate our friends and neighbors, Everybody has a database on their cell phone or on their computer. And just a quick note to your friends, letting them know how much you love America, how much you love liberty, justice, and freedom, and maybe point out one or two things that you're concerned about. And it'll just help your fellow man stay informed about what's going on and get a feeling for the intensity and the gravity, the importance of the times that we're in right now. And then finally, the indictment comes. A prince whose character is defined by all of the marks of a tyrant, a murderous dictator, is not fit to be the leader of a free nation. And that's the statement that separates the 13 colonies in 1776 from the English crown. I just like to say in closing that human history is really interesting, that it does repeat itself. And the benefit of studying history is learning that if we don't take the proper actions and proper steps, we will repeat history. And I'm looking forward to a peaceful, loving world where love for our neighbors and fellow citizens is the most important thing, while we provide for our families and procreate and do all the things that God put us on this great earth to do. Nationalism is very important. And I know we're moving in the right direction because God has us all in his hands. So my final close would be the Aaronic blessing that says, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May God lift up his countenance upon you and give you his shalom. Good night.